They just did not match the property. We thought he must be a bookie. And they looked very Italian, and he had on a sport shirt buttoned up to the neck, a plaid shirt buttoned up to the neck with no tie, and he just looked like he must be in the mafia or something. We didn't know about the mafia then, I didn't think, but it turned out that he was a cutter for some inexpensive men's suit company, and that was his business. And I don't know how they afforded that house, because it was a big 3-story, beautiful house. Although it had belonged to the Catholic Church, nuns had lived there, I think, prior to their living there. So I don't know. There may have been, if they were Catholic, maybe some connection there. I don't know.
How long were you there?
We were there until you were about a year and a half.
So, a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was. And then
you said something one time about her baking habit.
hers,
Yeah.
Mrs. Purnham.
Purnham.
Well, Mr. Purnham made their pasta.
Oh.
They had 6 children, and they had a huge old gas range in the kitchen must have had, it was at least 6 burners. And then they had a butcher block table that must have been 6 feet long, and he would cut his pasta on that table. But she called it gravy. She called spaghetti sauce gravy, and she would bring us over a bowl of spaghetti quite often. And I told her one time that I would like to have a recipe, and she said, oh, she didn't have a recipe. And she spoke quite broken English. I would just have to come and watch her make it. Well, I found out, much to her embarrassment and mine too, that she couldn't read. I had given her something one time to read, and she held it upside down, and I realized she couldn't read nor write. But she taught me to make spaghetti sauce. But this one time she had invited me to come over for tea, and she took a small saucepan, couldn't have been a quart, and filled it half with water, and then she poured loose tea, and she must have poured half a cup, and boiled it, and boiled it, and boiled it. Oh dear, it was horrible. Oh, I didn't quite know how to handle it. Oh dear. But they were very kind to us, very nice, and they dearly loved little Eddie.
So were you accustomed to eating that exotic foods of that nature before, or was your diet a lot different than that growing up?
Yes, growing up, we didn't have anything that was highly spiced. In fact, Daddy's Aunt Sina, she was one, if not the first, she was one of the first women doctors in Philadelphia. And although she specialized in eyes, she was big on nutrition as well. And she thought that black pepper was about poison to the system. She didn't believe that was good for us. So we didn't have much pepper, although it was usually on the table. But we ate pretty simply, and very well, reasonably too, because they were very economical in their cooking. But the only spaghetti I ever remember having as a child came out of a can, and it was awful.
You told me before too about the stove that y'all had when you were a child. Seems like you had a gas.
We did have a gas stove. There was a stove foundry in Hatboro, the Quality Range Company, and Nancy's daddy worked there. And well, he was an officer there. He was and pretty well-to-do. But yeah, this was up on legs. Our stove was up on legs, and the oven was beside the burners. And white enamel and black. But and a hood over the burner part with a shelf on it with matches and stuff. And salt kept up there, kept it nice and dry. And then I don't remember how old I was when they got a new quality range. It was more modern. But they did a lot of cooking on that old one. I remember they got the new refrigerator too. I had mentioned the old ice box, but they bought a new Frigidaire. Boy, it was big. But the ice never tasted as good.
Your grandmother wasn't again until, I guess, until she passed away.
Yes, she did. She died my second year at Hood. The spring of my second year at Hood. She had fallen and broke her shoulder, and she had heart trouble. She would have what she called heart spells when it would palpitate, beat quickly, but she would just sit quietly for a while and it would pass. But I think she took some kind of heart medication. Our family doctor was an important member of the family too, and he would visit her there at home. He made house calls fairly often. Sometimes had breakfast with us. Dr. Regelman. Grandmother had, when she fell, because of her heart condition, they couldn't really set her shoulder, and just had to tape it, and she would never have been able to raise that arm, and she just lost any will to live because she knew she wouldn't be able to be productive anymore, and she just kind of went rapidly downhill from then on, and just lived a couple of months. The doctor told Mother that she had just given up. But I remember we had her funeral at home, and the undertaker was a country undertaker from Southampton or somewhere. And I remember coming down the stairs. The casket was right at the foot of the stairs in front of that fireplace. And the casket was open, and the undertaker was there dusting her face with a little brush. And I was horrified, and it was a cosmetic thing. He was putting powder on her face. And I objected to that. I said, she's never worn makeup, and she shouldn't. That's not right, that you should be putting makeup on her. And he explained to me that in life, that blemishes are not noticeable, but in death they are. And that he handled it very nicely. But it was, of course, by that time, most of her friends were gone. She was 85, I think, when she died, 85 or 6. And we had a Quaker ceremony in our living room with chairs set up around, probably 40, 50 people there maybe. I remember Mother speaking in memory of her mother, which was very nice.
You were married in that Quaker church too, weren't you?
Yes, we were married at, well, Dad became a Quaker, and I can't remember whether that was before we were married or afterwards. But we were married in a Quaker meeting in Horsham meeting because it was closer, and it was only 2 miles from our home. And it was the same meeting house where Glenn and Ellen had been married. And it was more suitable than our meeting house. No minister officiating. We walked in together and then sat down facing the meeting. And after 15 minutes or so of worship, so-called, whatever it was, of silence, waiting on the Lord, we thought we were doing, we stood and faced each other and spoke our vows to each other. And started out in the presence of God and these our friends. And spoke our vows that way. And then afterwards we had to sign a wedding certificate. It was all legal, of course. But we had to go to Norristown, the county seat, and you had to get a special marriage license. It was different for Quakers than for others. And then there was quite a lot of speaking after that, after we said our vows and sat down again, and there was a meeting for worship with counsel to the newlyweds and so on. But so awesome. Been so sorry that I wasn't a Christian earlier, but the Lord knows the times, doesn't he?
I guess we brought it up to the Heather Road era.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we moved there when you were under 2. Well, we lost our second baby in August of 53. You were born in March of 52, and he was August of 53. And we moved into the Heather Road house then, close to that time. Well, no, it was late in the fall, I think.
So that would have been
The first house we owned. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then
that was a fairly tight-knit neighborhood too.
yes, it was. It was an interesting neighborhood with that tract of land had been an estate, and there were still estates up at the end of the street and on down Spring Avenue and that area. So I guess it was the Elkins estate. Elkins Avenue was in there, I know. They were very narrow lots, 30-foot wide lots. But we each had our driveway and garage. So they were stone front, stucco side, very well built houses, 3-story and full basement.
When was those been built? 30s
or before that, maybe even the late 20s, I believe. Not positive. And we had good neighbors. The Platts were good neighbors. They were there when we moved in, and so were the Burkheads. The terror of your childhood, Henry Burkhead. He was something. They were both adopted. Do you realize? Georgie and Henry were both adopted.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
Their dad worked on the railroad. You understand that?
No. Well,
daytime, didn't he?
right, he
Night?
worked at night.
His mom went to the Navy.
I think she did. I've forgotten that.
They could have used a pretty firm hand. For Georgie, his brother, was kind of wasn't like that.
No.
Just kind of pleasant.
Yeah, he was not real bright.
He's a lot pleasanter in person.
Yes. Henry, but nowadays they would have called Henry hyperactive. Oh dear, I never knew what he was going to do. Set fire to the leaves up that big house up the street. He did at our house once too. Do you remember that? Out front, the leaves of the ivy.
Right, that's not right.
Mhm. Yeah. It was a terror.
Did Dad go to work for the telephone company at that time? Or was that
Yes.
really, it was after he quit the milk business?
He had been several since then. After the milk business, I'm not sure what came next. He worked for an employment service. He hated that. That was like flesh peddling, he said. And he couldn't really be honest. He was very uncomfortable with that. And he worked for Fred Petrie in the sheet metal shop for a while. And maybe it was after that he went with a telephone company. He worked with Bell, and that was a college training program supposed to be. And he worked for them for a couple of years and was kind of at a dead end with them. And then went with General Telephone, where Margaret's father was vice president in charge of operations in the New York office. And so he lived in New York during the week and was home weekends he worked for General for 2 years, I think. And the first year he came home just on weekends, and then he did it every day, which was terribly hard on him, on all of us. A lot of strains on the family. I really don't remember the sequence of his jobs, but then we heard about Dad and Mother by that time were living in Florida, in Sebring, and found out that the Western Auto Store was available for sale. And he had always wanted a hardware store, hardware business. So he came down and looked at it and liked it, thought it sounded like a good thing, and it was, so I agreed to it, of course, but that was the beginning of the end of the marriage. Although I agreed and really did agree, I felt like it was the wife's place to go along with her husband, and he needed to be happy in what he was doing, and he really had never been. And it was terrible to have him go off to work hating what he was doing, and miserable in it, although he wasn't a complainer, but he was just not happy. But he really enjoyed the business down here, but I went into real depression. Oddly enough, I felt a real kinship with the children of Israel and getting into the wilderness, and I just felt cut off. And of course, my family was important to me, and although Dad and Mother lived here part of the year, Bob and Jane were important members of our circle of friends up there, and the meeting was important to us, and so on. I just was very unhappy and couldn't really cope with it. And I was not a help to him in the business. I didn't want to work there, and I didn't really want to work. I wanted to be a mother, and he was, of course, usually at the store. It was not a good situation. But his mother was a big help to him then, working in the store, and she was very supportive to him. She was a wonderful mother-in-law. She really was a good person. With a lot of heartache in her family, her life too. Divorced after 32 or 3 years of marriage. Well, she and Grandpa Bill were divorced the year Tommy was born. In 57. The same month. And her parents both died within 6 months of each other the same year. Yeah. It was a hard time for her.
I remember her living in Jenkintown working at Walmart.
Yes. She had a nice little apartment there with a young couple. I think it was in a house. Young couple on the second floor, and she had the first floor. Yeah, she went to get a job, and she had never been employed before. She had worked at the Bryn Mawr Hospital thrift shop, but she had never had a paying job. And she was 57 or 8, and her supervisor came in one time, and she heard the supervisor say, "Who ever hired a woman 58 years old, never employed before?" Well, it wasn't long before Graham was the top salesperson in the department. She did really well. It was quite an addition to the workforce there. Yeah. And she was, of course, a very attractive, well-dressed person. And made an excellent salesperson.
I guess that's what she did here in Western.
She worked at the store. Margaret and I went into that same John Wanamaker store in May when I was up.
Is that in Willowgrove?
No, it's in Jenkintown.
Oh, okay.
But it's to be closed in July. Closing it. Not making out. Things are changing there too.